With our recent playthrough of Resident Evil 2 on the channel, we thought, why not go back and take a look at where the franchise began? Resident Evil gave something gamers didn't know they actually wanted, with the very first actual instance of survival horror in the gaming industry. A game that is stacked full of iconic moments. It's no wonder why it's still held up so highly amongst fans today. With those challenging puzzles and those eerie hallways and those monstrous creatures, it's no wonder why Resident Evil is just held in such high regard. So with that said, I'm Jay from Gamecast, and let's get right into it. This is Resident Evil, the origin of survival horror.
Resident Evil.
Way back in the year 1996, Capcom dropped Resident Evil for the PlayStation 1. Original development for the game actually began 3 years beforehand. Resident Evil actually took inspiration from the Capcom game Sweet Home that was released in 1989, which Resident Evil was supposed to be a remake of. The Resident Evil project was led by Shinji Mikami, who for the first 6 months, Mikami worked on the game alone, creating concept sketches, designing characters, and writing over 40 pages of the script. The hotel setting from The Shining was actually used as inspiration for the main setting of the game, with the Spencer Mansion being a map that required players to retrace their steps multiple times to solve puzzles and acquire items to progress further throughout the game. Shinji Mikami actually relucted to take on the project as he hated being scared and knew what was frightening. The infamous fixed camera angle was actually taken from the Alone in the Dark game from 1992, and has said that without Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil would actually have been first person. Early production of Resident Evil actually had cooperative gameplay included, but was removed due to technically not being good enough. Capcom didn't use any motion capture technology to make the game, instead studying how people, spiders, and other animals that you encounter throughout the game should move. The game was made using the soft image program using Silicon Graphics hardware. Towards the end of production, the Resident Evil team grew to a number of 80 people. Capcom was hesitant of porting the game to the Sega Saturn, as the console was just not suitable for the game as well as the PlayStation was. The game was finally announced that it would make its way to the Saturn in April of 1997 at the Tokyo Game Show, upon which Capcom actually unveiled a demo for the sequel on the PlayStation. The live action sequences in the game were all filmed in Japan using a group of American actors. It's interesting to note that in the Japanese version of the game, the same cutscenes appear with subtitles and captions, despite Japanese voice actors actually recording lines for the game. The name Resident Evil was actually not the game's original title. It's well known that the game is called Biohazard in its Japan version, but Chris Kamar, director of communications at Capcom, pointed out that trying to trademark the term Biohazard in the United States would be a waste of time, and so the team settled on the name Resident Evil due to the game taking place within a mansion. Before its English release, a number of changes were made. American staff members of Capcom requested that the game be made harder and that the auto-aim system to be removed. They also asked to reduce the number of ink ribbons within the game, thus limiting the amount of save games a player would have throughout the game. This was done as a strategy to limit the amount of gamers renting the game to finish within just a few days, hoping that the increased difficulty would encourage gamers to purchase their own copy of the game. Mikami said that this version proved fairly difficult for Capcom staff, who had to play very carefully to complete it. The game was released on the 22nd of March 1996, to a surprise reaction in the eyes of Capcom. They did not expect the game to sell well, estimating 200,000 copies to ship and being pleasantly surprised that the game would go on to sell millions. Even so, that became the best-selling PlayStation game of all time shortly after its release. Resident Evil was adored by critics, and in recent times, Game Informer has cited the game as one of the most important games of our time. The release of Resident Evil sparked a new lease of life into the horror genre itself. The game was so well received that it saw multiple follow-up games, books, a movie franchise, and remains at the top of discussions regarding survival horror even today. So for a game that seemed to not have too much backing or faith put into it, we can only thank Capcom for delivering a fun and fresh injection into the gaming world that still brings joy to gamers to this day as they seek to discover the horrors that go bump in the night. So with the news that Resident Evil 3 is finally being remade after the success of Resident Evil 2, and it's probably released since the time this video has dropped, it doesn't seem like the franchise is showing any signs of slowing down.